Hello and welcome to How to Play Magic with Rude Kaiser. Now I want to preface this with this is a lot of information, I mean a lot, so I expect you to be doing research on your own aside of this. This is supplementary, this is not like a whole thing, but I will be as succinct as I could possibly be. First and foremost, you, that's right, you are the Planeswalker, and your magic spells are etched into these very cards. The way to win the game is to reduce your opponent's life total to 0. There are many different ways to do that, and we'll get into all that in a second. But let's start with the basics of the game itself. Like we said, all the spells are on cards, and there are 6 card types. The first type is land. They are valuable resource cards. When they are destroyed, they get sent to your graveyard. We'll get into the graveyard in just a second. Stick with me on the card types for now. The next one is creature. They are one of the only ways to proactively deal damage to other planeswalkers. They also are sent to your graveyard when they are destroyed. They're sorceries. They are temporary effects that improve the caster's current position. These are sent to the graveyard once they are finished resolving. Again, put an asterisk, we'll get back to that. Instants. They are immediate effects. They are sent to the graveyard upon resolving as well. Then there's an enchantment. Enchantments, which offer permanent effects and are sent to the graveyard only when destroyed. And lastly, artifact cards, which are magical or mundane objects which any planeswalker can cast. And they too are sent to the graveyard when destroyed. Now if we look here at the field, we can see that each of us has a deck and a life total. Right over there is the graveyard, and everything else is the battlefield. That is where cards go when they are quote unquote in play. Right over here on the side, you can see that there are little notches. These are turn phases. Magic as a game has turns, and every turn has a phase. The phases will never change and always happen the exact same way in the exact same order. And that order is untap, upkeep, draw. Main phase 1, combat, main phase 2, and your end step. Each of these phases are unique and you can do different things on different ones. Starting from the very top, the untap step. Once your turn starts, everything that you have on the battlefield untaps. The upkeep is when a game has a chance to check for effects, so things that say at the beginning of your upkeep, you get this and that. On your turn, you are given 1 free card to draw, which then immediately takes you to your main phase. Your main phase and main phase 2 both happen at sorcery speed. So casting speeds are that of everything but instants happen at sorcery speed. Instants exclusively happen at instant speed. Instants can be cast in response to anything at any point as a reaction of sorts, but everything else, creatures, sorceries, enchantments, and artifacts, even lands, can only come into play on your main phase 1 or 2. Aside from your main phase, you have combat, which is where creatures swing at each other. Combat is incredibly complicated, so I'll be going into that in just a moment. Then after your second main phase, there is your end step, which ends all effects that are not permanent and removes damage from creatures. Now we'll get into casting spells. So as you can see, every spell costs, and what it costs is mana. I'm sure you're wondering, how do you get your hands on this precious coveted resource? Well, you need lands. Lands generate mana. Every turn, you may play 1 land from your hand at sorcery speed during your main phase or main phase 2. These lands will typically tap for some sort of mana. Most non-artifact spells will require a color of mana, be it white, blue, black, red, or green. The symbol on the card itself will tell you exactly what it costs to cast it, along with generic mana, which can be paid, of course, with mana of any color. A spell that costs white and 3 can be played if you have 4 white generating lands, 3 black generating lands and 1 white land, or 3 white generating lands and 1 green land. Once a spell is cast, it goes into what is called the stack, which allows other players a chance to activate instants or instant speed effects. If no one has any response to your spell, it resolves, and like we mentioned before, instants and sorceries resolve into the graveyard. Everything else, when it resolves, goes to the battlefield. So if your artifact is not responded to, it hits the field. If someone has an effect, then that will also go onto the stack alongside the spell you cast. The first spell put onto the stack will be the last one to resolve. Whatever effect or spell they play in response to your spell will always happen before yours does. Creatures. Creature cards are very interesting. They have subtypes, which there are a lot of, from Summon Dinosaur all the way to Eldrazi Insect. And they also have abilities, which there are also a lot of. Permanent mainstay abilities to tapping for mana, much like lands do. Now, tapping is a mechanic in Magic which requires you to turn something sideways, physically denoting that it is quote-unquote used for the turn. Remember, at the beginning of your turn, everything you have that is tapped will untap, allowing you to use it again. It is just a way to denote that it is currently expended. Back to being the Planeswalker, the creatures that you evoke must travel through what is known as the Blind Eternities when cast. This trip leaves them weary and inflicted with an illness known as Summoning Sickness. Creatures with this illness cannot be tapped for their abilities or attack. But worry not, for this is cured at the start of your next upkeep, as long as the creature is still there. Creatures deal damage with their power, which would be the first number, and take damage from their toughness. So a creature that deals 2 damage and can take 2 damage would not be able to kill or be killed by a creature that deals 1 damage and can be dealt 4. But how do we make these creatures deal damage? Well, that's what combat is all about. So combat is dead set in the middle of every turn, and it itself has its own little sub-steps. Once you go to combat, you must formally announce that you are entering the combat step. After that, you tap all the creatures that you wish to attack with and declare who they will be attacking. Once all that is done, the opponent has the opportunity to declare blockers, given the chance to throw whatever untapped creatures they control between them and your attacking force. The typical creature can only block 1 attacking creature a turn. After that's all done, damage is dealt, and with all the carnage that's ensued, combat ends. With that, you should be able to figure your way through almost any endeavor. But just in case you're looking for a little bit of extra help, most other things are written on the cards themselves, so remember to read your cards carefully.